So I was planning a wedding, and I came across a story about a man in Florida who had been married to his wife for 50 years. They had, I want to say, three kids together. He was a really successful businessman in the community and really well respected, well known, well liked. His wife died, and then 2 weeks later, there was a wedding announcement from a newspaper in a town about 20 miles away. And it was his picture, his first name, but a different last name, and a woman nobody knew. And it was their wedding announcement. But it turned out he had lived this whole life with her for 20 years, no, sorry, 30 years, 20 miles away from each other. He had two kids with her. All five kids had gone to the same elite private school. He'd bought both women like the same, I think, white Lexus at different times. The women both served on the school board together. I know. And so, as I was thinking about what it meant to plan a wedding and plan a future and plan a life, it was very chilling, this idea that like you could be married to somebody for 50 years. And for 30 of them, this person has deceived you in the worst possible way. They have this entire other life and other family 20 minutes away, right? Like how does that work? How does somebody get into a situation like that and justify it and maintain it over decades, right? And so that kind of caught my attention, and I started, digging into similar double life stories, and like very quickly it became clear that the pattern was that these were all men. I didn't find a single story of a woman who had lived a similar double life. And so then, it made me curious as to why. And there are some answers that are, really obvious, right? Which is that it's a lot harder, particularly, let's say, um, anything before the 1970s or 80s, right? Like I think a woman needed her husband's signature to approve her getting a credit card or her own account at the bank. So like financially, there were differences, when it came to women in the workforce, there were differences. When it came to women being able to travel, there were differences. If a woman is a mother, it's a lot harder to kind of like split herself in two in that way, right? But it did make me wonder, like, well, what if a woman did that? Would there be, what are the similarities and differences to when a man does it? Like, is it possible to ever understand like this kind of really unfathomable choice, right? And is it possible to sympathize with it in any way, right? And so this was at the time when I was working on my collection of short stories, and I had a really strong sense that I wanted it, that the question was compelling to me, but that it seemed bigger than a short story. It seemed different than the project I was working on, and I felt like it should be a novel. And I think also because I had initially read about it in a newspaper, I always imagined there being sort of like a frame narrative with some kind of, journalist figure in there. But it wasn't the time, and so I didn't do anything about it. And so I want to say probably almost 10 years went by. I was divorced and remarried, and I was actually on submission with another novel at the time, and I was starting to get some rejections and feeling a lot of anxiety. And so my agent was like, well, if you have another idea, now would be the time to start working on it, right? Get your mind off of, the fact that we're not getting the responses we'd hoped for. And so this was the story that came to mind. And yeah, I sat down with it, and I think I was 10 years older. I'd been through divorce, I was remarried. I found out I was pregnant that same month. And so a lot of the same themes were sort of hitting me differently, right, at this different phase in life. And so yeah, I started thinking about it, and exploring who these characters might be. And Lore, to answer your question, came to me very fully formed once I decided on the time and the place of the story. She was there. I think she had been somewhat percolating maybe in my subconscious for a while, because yeah, she was, I think it's one of those, sort of rare occasions as a writer, at least to me, when a character comes like that fully formed. Because yeah, it's not always like that, and Cassie certainly wasn't for me. So yeah, it was a lot of the time I felt like I was sort of channeling her voice more than um, laboring over it, which is like just one of the greatest joys, as a writer. For Lore and for Cassie in particular, I used something called Proust's questionnaire. So it was like a parlor game. I don't know if Proust invented it or if he just popularized it. I think he just popularized it. And it's, I believe, about 21 questions that, according to Proust, if a person were to answer all of them honestly, it gets at the essence of who someone really is. And to me, it feels like a good first way into a character. There are questions like describe a moment of perfect happiness, or, and simple things too, right? What is your greatest fear? What is your greatest desire? What is something you dislike about yourself? What is something you're ashamed of? So questions like that, that can be really like fertile ground when it comes to just getting to know a character. So I did a lot of that with Lore and with Cassie. I think what helped the most from a plotting perspective was I mentioned deciding when and where the story would take place. And so I'm from Laredo, where the story takes place, and so that felt very natural to me because in grad school I'd sort of uh, come around to this idea that South Texas is actually a very interesting place, which I think I grew up thinking like, oh, it's just normal, it's just boring, and getting living outside of Laredo in particular, I was able to sort of see it with different eyes and older eyes and eyes that had been to other places, right? And really appreciate the things that make it a really interesting and special place. And so that idea of returning or bringing Laredo to life on the page in fiction was really compelling to me because growing up, I read, one Latina author, in my first 18 years, right? Like there just was so little Latino representation in publishing, and there still is. I think it's like something around 6% of published authors are of Latino descent. And so it felt really important to me to represent where I came from, my culture, and like the patterns of speech that you hear down there, or down here. And so it was like, okay, where is it taking place? Laredo, check. When is it taking place? I thought, okay, if it's set currently, there are a lot of obstacles to overcome when it comes to like social media and phones and the internet in general. Like, how does somebody pull something like this off today? And that felt really challenging to me. So I was like, well, what if we just circumvent all of that and, go back to a time before, right? And then I thought about, stories that my parents told me growing up about the 1980s. I was born in 84, and so I was too little to really remember these years, but and actually 84 is slightly after the time period of the book. But it was a time when the US was going through a recession, and for a while, Laredo, being on the border, was sort of protected from it because the peso hadn't yet devalued. And so we rely a lot on shoppers coming in from Mexico, right? And a lot of Laredo's income comes from Mexican nationals. But when the peso did devalue, Laredo sort of suffered twice, right? We suffered from the devaluation of the dollar and the peso. And so all of a sudden it was like 700 businesses closed. And Laredo is really, it's a town of small business. It's 250,000-ish people, I think now, maybe a bit more, but then it would have been maybe 150, maybe 120,000 people. So, 700 small businesses closing was a lot. I mean, it was devastating for the city. So I grew up with stories my parents told me of that time period. And I thought, a situation like that where where a person is put in extreme circumstances is a lot more likely to produce extreme decisions, right? Or decisions that wouldn't be made in ordinary times when everything's good. And so kind of deciding, okay, it's going to be set in Laredo in the 1980s, that really opened me up to, okay, now who is this woman, right? How is she able to travel? How does she pull this off? And what's motivating her to pull this off? And so that was really the opening into developing her character. I was really interested in exploring, like you mentioned Dateline, and Dateline is, important in the book in the context of the character of Cassie, who sort of is introduced to true crime through Dateline, right? And watching Dateline specifically with her mom. And so I was really interested in, the way true crime has become like this cultural phenomenon in the United States. Like I feel like even 10 years ago, if you said like, yeah, I like to watch shows about murder. I like to listen to podcasts about murder. I'm just a real fan of murder. Like you would have gotten a side eye, but now it's like, you have like these true crime conventions, Murder Con, I think is an actual name of one. I might be wrong, but it's interesting to me how the primary audience of true crime skews so female. And so Rachel Monroe wrote an excellent book called Savage Appetites. And so that was, a book that I used to sort of get into this question of like, why do women, including me, right? Why are we drawn to true crime? And Rachel sort of talks about these four archetypes that a female audience might tend to relate to, right? There's like the victim, the detective, the murderer, the perpetrator, and oh my gosh, the protector or the defender. Um, and so thinking about thinking about that, right? Why are we compelled by true crime? And then looking at some of the statistics of true crime, which is, like you said, this idea that, when women are killed, it's actually much less common for it to happen by a stranger than it is to happen by an intimate partner, and what that means for our most personal relationships. And thinking about also the kind of victims who tend to get attention in this kind of true crime culture, right? Like they most often tend to be like middle class or wealthy, white, young. There's like this archetype of like who is the perfect victim? Who is the victim that we can get the most people to feel sympathetic toward, right? And these were all really interesting questions to me. And I do like to, I think, come at a question from by flipping it in a certain way. And so the idea of, Cassie is this aspiring true crime reporter, I could see where somebody who's kind of like wanting to cut her teeth and make her name would be really interested in a case where the woman's not dead. The woman's not innocent either. She's out here living two lives, and the result of her living two lives is that one of her husbands ends up dead, right? And so, and then where's the line if you're exploring a question like that? Like from a journalist perspective, where's the line between um, trying to tell this story in the most ethical way possible versus some of these boundaries getting blurred and thinking more about your own potential gains from telling such a story, and then also getting a little bit closer possibly to the subject of your story than a journalist is supposed to. So these were also all interesting kind of ideas for me to explore. And then as far as the husbands, individual characters are involved. So Lore's first husband, his name is Fabian, and he's well known in my family. He's my dad's favorite character because I based some of him on my dad. My dad owned an electrical supply store in the 1980s during the peso devaluation, and when things were really bad, he went up to Austin and he was going up and down, 4 hours back and forth to Austin, I think over a period of 2 years. And he was like selling light fixtures from the back of his car and sleeping, on warehouse floors and showering in gym just to try to keep the business afloat. And so in the story, Fabian owns a business called Rivera Iron Works. And similarly, the business suffers when the peso devalues. And so he goes up to Austin in a similar way. And it creates this gap in a way, because not even so much the gap of distance, but this gap of like needing to provide, needing to be the provider for the family, right? And getting swept up in that personal desire. Whereas Lore, working for a bank, her job was pretty stable. Fabian, she recognizes, I think, early on that Fabian needs to do this for himself. It's not even really about the family, right? And then meanwhile, Lore's job sort of allows her to travel into Mexico as an international banker. And that's where she meets Andres, who is sort of a counterpoint to Fabian in many ways. And I see both of the men as being kind and loving men, right? That was really important to me. Like I wanted them to feel complex as well, right? And not have it be like, well, yeah, that's an easy explanation. Lore, cheats on Fabian because he's a crappy husband. I think that's too easy. And I think that, for her, and particularly, she's a mother of twin boys, but she's still quite young in her early 30s. And what does it mean to have lived your entire decade of your 20s as a mother and then be in this point where you're breadwinning for your family, your children don't need you as much, your husband is trying for his own reasons to be the provider, what situation, what emotional landscape does that create inside of a woman, that might open her up to making some of these decisions?